Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gabriel Zamosc-Regueros. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the College of Liberal Arts and Science at the University of Colorado, Denver. And today we're going to talk about some topics in Nietzsche's philosophy. So, Dr. Zamosc-Regueros, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here with you and your audience, and I hope we can have a good interview and conversation.
Great. So I would like to start by asking you about some of the ideals of Nietzsche's that you talk about in your work. So you've done work on the ideals of sovereignty, of wholeness, and of becoming what one is in Nietzsche's philosophy. So let's tackle each of them in turn and discuss your views and interpretations of them. Starting with becoming what one is, what is that really about?
Yes. So, as you say, I kind of, when I was writing my dissertation, I wanted to focus it a little bit on the positive side of Nietzsche's philosophy. Typically, when you read Nietzsche, you realize that Nietzsche is against all sorts of things. He's against Christian morality, democracy, all sorts of criticisms that he advances, truth perhaps even, metaphysics, whatever. So he has many negative things to say about all sorts of things, but I was always curious about, well, what is his positive philosophy? What is he proposing? What are his ideals? Does he have any interesting thing to offer in terms of things he wants us to pursue or such? And that led me to focus on some of the ideals that he seems to be espousing. So as you said, you mentioned becoming who you are or what you are. It's a phrase that recurs throughout all of Nietzsche's philosophical development. You can find, actually the actual phrase, you can find it even in the Untimely Meditations, because he talks about Wagner in the Wagner meditation, Wagner in Bayreuth. He talks about it as Wagner looking into himself, and then this act of looking into himself, he describes as how Wagner became what he is and will be. So he actually uses that phrase in the third meditation on Schopenhauer as educator. He tells us that your conscience tells you be who you are or be yourself. He doesn't quite use the expression as become who you are, but he says be yourself. Everything you're doing right now is not you yourself. You are inauthentic in some sense. So you get it there. Then you see it echoed in Gay Science, obviously in a passage that gets cited a lot. The passage, I forget the numbers. I'm very bad at remembering section numbers and stuff. So forgive me for that. But he has that long passage about long-lived physics, and he said in that passage occurs the phrase in the context of saying something like, we are the ones who want to become who we are, beings who are unique, who create themselves, who give themselves laws, etc. You find it in Zarathustra, where he says, Zarathustra in the fourth book says, I am not for nothing, I am a person who's trying to fish men, right? He presents himself as a fisher of men, a person who's trying to raise up. Not for nothing, I'm a person who's told himself once, become who you are, right? It occurs, of course, in the famous autobiography of Nietzsche as a subtitle, right? How one becomes what one is. So it's a phrase that is recurring everywhere. Another ideal that seems to be present is this ideal of wholeness that people seem to have detected, right? Nietzsche wants us to become whole, or Goethe in The Twilight of the Idols wanted totality or wholeness or completion or something like that. So there seems to be some kind of ideal of wholeness. There also seems to be, for some people at least, although other people want to contend this claim, the ideal of sovereignty in the genealogy. This important passage in the second treatise of the genealogy, where Nietzsche presents the sovereign individual as the mankind come to completion. The tree of mankind the genealogical tree that we've been retracing here in this book, Nietzsche tells us, culminates with this fruit that is full of promise, the fruit of the sovereign individual. That seems to be an ideal that he wants to recommend to us. Moreover, notice the language of completion, right? The completion of mankind. So just like, people who want to create themselves, who want to be unique, who want to represent the completion of mankind or something like that. Okay, so these ideals, by the way, seem to be related to each other. And this is also part of what I want to just flag before I launch into trying to tell you my answer about what beyond becoming who you are or what you are means, that in some ways I might end up repeating myself in the course of this investigation in some of the answers, because as I study these different ideals of Nietzsche's, I've come to the realization that there are things that repeat themselves. They're echoes of the ways in which he conceptualized one of the ideals that are repeated in the ways in which he conceptualized the others. So all these ideals in some ways are different ways of talking about the same thing in the end, I think. When you read Nietzsche carefully, you kind of start to realize that's kind of what's going on. You could add other ideals that I don't discuss right now, or maybe we won't discuss today, the superhuman ideal that Zarathustra presents to us. I would probably lean towards the idea that this is another way of speaking of the same thing. So that the superhuman in some ways shares many features of the sovereign individual, of the ideal of wholeness, and of the ideal of becoming who you are. This is why Zarathustra himself explicitly says, I'm the one who told himself, become who you are. So that's the first caveat. The second caveat I wanted to introduce, that I'll be repeating myself as the first caveat, but the second caveat I wanted to introduce is that there's something a little bit, I don't know how to put this exactly, but artificial in the way we Nietzsche scholars approach Nietzsche. We forget a little bit that Nietzsche is an outsider. He comes to philosophy as an outsider. He's not really trained in philosophy. He has theological interest as a very young man that he, of course, quickly shies away from, in part thanks to his having been brought up in the classicist tradition and the humanitarian tradition of the school board that he attended, that he had the privilege to attend. And so he becomes, thanks to that influence, a philologist. But philology is also not philosophy, right? So he was either a theologian trying to, following his father's footsteps, perhaps, and become a priest or a pastor or somebody who thinks about God a lot, or he became a kind of classicist in the end. Of course, in becoming a classicist, and even also in being a theologian, he indirectly dabbles in philosophical concerns, of course, because these areas, if you're a classicist, you're going to have to read the ancient philosophers, right? Among the other things that you're going to be reading. So you're going to read ancient philosophers and you're going to get exposure to philosophy that way, for sure. But he's always an outsider. He's also an outsider in his own field of training in some ways, because he does philology in a very weird way, and which is why he was chastised from the field thanks to the publication of his first major book, Birth of Tragedy, as you may know. So we forget this. And why is this important? Because in some ways, Nietzsche is not a traditional philosopher. What this means is that when Nietzsche comes to philosophy, he doesn't come to philosophy with the traditional concerns of what people trained in the philosophical tradition, in the discipline of philosophy, let's say, come with, right? And what are those? Typically, there are things like metaphysics and epistemology. I want to know, what is it to know? What is the difference between knowing something and just happening to have a true opinion about something? What exactly is truth, anyways? Things like that. Or what is the nature of reality, right? What is the cosmos made of? What exactly is nature? How does it work? Is it made of atoms? Is it, what? Okay. So what is matter? And then what is the relationship between matter and mind? I have minds, and materialistic philosophy seems to miss the mind, as Nietzsche, who read Lang, would know. This is one of the recurring themes in Lang's History of Materialism, which Nietzsche read very early on when he was very young. That materialism, the thing that materialism cannot handle is experience, the mental, what today, following Chalmers and others, we call the hard problem of consciousness or something, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, this is the repeated wall against which materialism cracks its head, okay? These problems, or in the case that pertains to us, actually, let me just mention one last one. The problem, a sub-problem of a metaphysical field, the problem of free will, right? Is the world, is reality made in such a way that you can have creatures that have free will, or does the nature of reality simply exclude the possibility of having creatures with a free will, right? That's a subfield of a metaphysical problem. And so Nietzsche, even though he will make claims that, of course, are claims that you would have to categorize, put under the umbrella of metaphysical claims, or claims about metaphysics, or claims about epistemology, or claims about free will, right? The debate on free will. He's making those claims not because he wants to contribute to the field of metaphysics, or to contribute to the field of epistemology, or even, in the case that I'm interested in, perhaps, the field of free will debates, okay? Mm-hmm. And I think that's important, because when we miss that, we are in danger of falling into certain traps. Okay, we're in danger of falling into certain traps when we approach Nietzsche's philosophy. We're in danger of, I don't know, to use the kind of typical expression, missing the forest for the trees, right? And even missing the trees, because we mischaracterize those trees, the metaphysical concerns that he supposedly has, or the epistemological concern, or his concern with free will, right? We miss those things, and in missing, even in themselves, but more importantly, we miss what Nietzsche is actually trying to do in his philosophy, which is not contribute to perhaps metaphysical debates, or contribute to epistemological debates, or contribute to the free will debate, okay, as we understand it. So that's it. That's a caveat I want to express here, right? So when we're looking for, and part of the issue here too is that we have those concerns because we are trained as philosophers, and we're interested in my case, the free will debate a little bit, right? That's one of my interests. Okay, fantastic. But in bringing this interest into Nietzsche's philosophy, I may end up twisting Nietzsche's philosophy beyond recognition, because I kind of foist onto Nietzsche and a demand that he answer the questions that I'm interested in, even though he maybe doesn't want to, right? He's doing something else. And so that's a pitfall. That's a danger I can fall into very easily. I can start reconstructing Nietzsche's metaphysics, trying to reconstruct it, right? When maybe Nietzsche was not interested in giving you a coherent picture of what his metaphysics were, okay? And stuff like that. So this is a danger that I think we have to be wary of, we have to be aware of, and we have to try to bring to mind when we're trying to do these reconstructions. Because the other thing I want to say is, I'm not disparaging of the effort of trying to figure out what Nietzsche's moral psychology is, or to try to figure out what Nietzsche's metaphysics is, or to try to figure out what Nietzsche had to say about the free will debate, if he had any position that I can reconstruct or whatever in him. I don't disparage of those efforts. I think they're valuable, and we can learn things about Nietzsche's philosophy. But we should keep in mind that in some ways they're artificial. They're not really what Nietzsche is doing, okay? And that we therefore have to be careful not to miss what Nietzsche is actually doing. And so, having said that, of course, I myself am guilty of trying to do a kind of reconstruction sometimes of, what is Nietzsche saying, for instance, in Becoming Who You Are, to come back to your question now. Forgive me, I'll take sips of water every once in a while. I hope that's okay.
No, that's okay.
Okay, so in my case of trying to figure out what Nietzsche has to say about becoming who you are, I came into that debate, and by the way, this is not published. It's published as part of my dissertation. So in my dissertation, I tackled those three ideals that you mentioned: becoming who you are, wholeness, and sovereignty. But I've actually only published versions of what I wrote in my dissertation for the ideals of wholeness and for the ideals of sovereignty. I haven't really published what I wrote about becoming who you are, but it's still available online if people are interested in reading it. So you can find my dissertation online. Probably if you Google me and you'll find the dissertation, you'll be able to read it. In the case of becoming who you are, I kind of went into it because there was a sort of debate that in the literature about how to understand becoming who you are, framed in terms of two sort of positions, right? One was Nehama's position, where becoming who you are is about organizing yourself or your mental life to some extent, or yourself into a narrative unity in the way literature kind of constructs narratives, where you organize what you think, what you want, what you desire into this kind of narrative unity. And then there is the sort of Brian Leiter position, for instance, that wants to see becoming who you are as a kind of causally determined process, where you're destined to become what you were always naturally destined to become because of your essential natural properties or characteristics or something like that, which very diametrically opposed, right, ways of thinking. And I was like, well, let me explore what does it mean to become who you are according to Nietzsche. In the book that bears the subtitle, the phrase in its subtitle, namely Ecce Homo, what exactly is Nietzsche here doing? What does he have to say about how you become who you are? And does that reveal whether Nietzsche is thinking that human beings have no agential capacity, like Leiter wants us to think, or whether Nietzsche thinks that humans do have some kind of agential capacity, do contribute to the process of becoming who they are in some way, which would imply they have some kind of autonomy or free will in what they're doing, okay? And then, maybe ask questions about, well, but is that about organizing yourself in the way that Nehama's things or not, okay? And so when I did that, and I started to explore, I noticed that there are, of course, many things Nietzsche says in Ecce Homo that sound like the picture of fatalism that Brian Leiter likes to emphasize, right? Nietzsche talks about instincts that he has that kind of direct him to particular places and do all those kinds of things. But he also has other moments where he seems to speak of reflection and consciousness and self-knowledge and coming to reflect and find reason in reality, prompted by the fact that he was sick, which have a consequence that sounds a little bit contrary to what the Leiter picture is presenting us, namely the consequence of actually creating instincts in you that you didn't have before. So there's a point in Ecce Homo, I forget which section exactly, I think it might be the why am I so clever or intelligent section, where he says, I have people need to have an instinct of self-defense, which is also called taste, to preserve their task and their uniqueness so that they can become who they are. And I totally lacked it. Okay, I had no instinct of self-defense for the longest part of my life. I lacked the instinct. It was thanks to my sickness that I started to reflect and find reason in reality. And thanks to this reflection and this finding reason in reality, I developed in the last 10 years of my life the instinct of self-defense, basically, is what he's saying, okay? I finally developed this instinct, which now seems to posit a kind of agential capacity that works by way of what typically we think agential capacities or free will in the human being works, namely by practical deliberation. There's some kind of practical deliberation. You're using your reason. You come to know something about yourself, and this self-knowledge transforms the way you act in the world, right? So your self-understanding creates intentions in you that then you go out into the world to manifest, right? In this case, the intention to create an instinct of freedom and to cultivate it in the right way. Sorry, not an instinct of freedom, it's instinct of self-defense, and cultivate it in the right way, right? There is also another moment in Nietzsche's, actually the moment where he finally tells us how you become what you are, right? There comes a moment in Ecce Homo where he says, I can no longer delay telling you, reader, how you become how you are. You become how you are by keeping your autonomy agency away by not understanding yourself too quickly, by not engaging in this process of self-knowledge and self-reflection too quickly, right? You have to be careful. You have to guard against your autonomy, against this capacity you have to, through your reflection and your rationality, inject yourself into the causal stream of your life, right? You have to be careful, because injecting yourself into the causal stream of your life too soon, when you don't really have a correct understanding of who you are, is problematic, right? This is something that he says in Ecce Homo 2. So this again would mean, oh, we have a practical capacity, we have some kind of free will that functions in the way that typically free wills have been characterized to function, namely self-reflection, self-understanding, reason, right, rationality, self-knowledge. And with this self-knowledge and reflection and all that stuff, you form intentions that are truly your own, and you inject yourself into the causal stream of the world. Now, I don't know if I actually answered your question about what is it to become who you are, because of course, you're supposed to prevent your autonomy from knowing itself too quickly, and therefore intervening in your life too quickly. Nietzsche says, in particular, you should guard against all great gestures, right? So becoming attached to great causes or all great, he should probably, I don't think he mentioned it, but he should also probably say great men, like he did, for instance, with Wagner back when he was young, right? Because they might not be so great in the end, right? And you are yet not in the position to realize that and to know that. So you have to disengage your autonomous agency sometimes. You have to adopt a kind of fatalistic attitude of the sort perhaps Brian Leider would like to recommend, namely, just be a causal spectator of your life instead of being an active contributor to it, right? But you do all those things so that eventually you recover yourself and your agency and become who you are, presumably, right? Mm. Which, by the way, if we go back to what I just told you about Wagner, right? Nietzsche in the Wagner meditation says Wagner looks into himself. He has a moment of introspection. He has a moment of self-awareness, of self-understanding, of self-knowledge. And that's how he became who he was, right? That's what Nietzsche tells us, or what he was and what he will be, what he will be for the future. Involves, therefore, this kind of rationality, right? But what is it that you become when you become who you are? That's a big question, right? And of course, one of the things that comes out, if you look at, if you trace the occurrence of this phrase throughout Nietzsche's work in the ways I've done, right, in the gay science, it's that it's about becoming unique in some sense, right? Becoming the unique person you have it in you to become. But what is this uniqueness exactly, right? Well, in some sense, we're all unique, right? Obviously, because we are, as Nietzsche says in the meditations, actually in the second meditation, third meditation, Schopenhauer as educator, you are born right now to this moment, to this era where you had whole eternities to have been born, right? and whole eternities in the future to have been born, but no, you're born right now. And it's because you're born right now that you have this kind of impulse to, and this demand placed on you to become the unique person you can have it in you to become, okay? There's a sense of uniqueness there that is kind of, each person is an individual that is irrepeatable, right? That will never again be here, right? No, never again will there be a Ricardo Lopez. Never again will there be a Gabriel Zamosc, right? It's kind of like we are unique in that sense. But that's not the sense of uniqueness that's at stake here, you see? It's not just that you're an individual self that is irrepeatable, that is completely different from other selves and all that stuff. It's not identity, uniqueness, or anything like that that's at stake. I think for Nietzsche, what's at stake is, and here we maybe start to drift into the other ideals, right? What's at stake is the realizing this productive uniqueness that is possible for you, that has to be linked to, well, broader issues, which are the issues that Nietzsche really is interested in. Going back to the issue of, we miss Nietzsche's philosophy for the trees, right? We're interested in these insular problems of free will and whatever, and we miss that what Nietzsche's philosophy is interested in is not the insular problem of free will or whatever, but rather human flourishing and like culture and society, and how do we ennoble cultures and societies and the human beings that live in them, right? That's really the project that Nietzsche has in mind. It's a moral and political project to some extent, and everything he does in his philosophy is in the service of that, really. Okay, so the issue then is about how we connect back to those topics, whatever it is we're doing in this, in these trees that we're interested in analyzing, whether it's the metaphysics, the moral psychology, or what have you. I think that's one of the issues. Maybe I should pause a little to get you to, because otherwise I'll keep going forever.
No, yeah, I was just thinking you've already you've already talked a little bit about uniqueness. So let me ask you, if becoming what one is involves active self-reflection, as you mentioned there, how do you square that off with Nietzsche's takes on drives and his seemingly deterministic take on free will?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a complicated issue, and I'm going to introduce another caveat, which is I'm probably going to disappoint you and your audience here, because I'm not going to have a perfect answer for you or a really good answer for you. But I mean, let me see, how can I tackle the issue? The first thing to say probably is, look, this is a metaphysical issue. This is the metaphysical issue of the free will debate, okay, basically, which is, if I describe the human being, if I have a moral psychology that describes the human being as being in a reductivist way, as having a comportment that reduces ultimately to whatever you want to say, drives, or desires, or quanta, doing whatever things in your brain, okay, whatever the hell it is, right? You have a moral psychology that ultimately is reductivist and that is deterministic, yeah? That says the relationships of these things occurring in your mental life are necessary, they're necessitated to occur because of other stuff that's going on, whether it's quanta, whether it's drives, whether it's whatever it is. And then you have a philosopher that is saying, hey, hold on a second, you contribute to your life by doing self-reflection and doing this. Now you have a problem, because you're like, wait a second, you're telling me there is some kind of agency that I have in my life, and yet this moral psychology is reductivistic and telling me that that my life, my actions and everything is basically governed by necessary processes that are outside of my control, right? That are not really under my control. How do I square that circle, right? Okay, yeah, that's the metaphysical problem of free will. It's presented as a problem of a dilemma argument. If the world is deterministic, right, as my science seems to tell me, it's a world of causal connections where things have causal relationships that necessitate their occurrence, then I couldn't have done otherwise. Then I can't be spontaneous in my actions. I can't have spontaneity in my choices. Free will, which is spontaneity in my choices, the capacity to do otherwise. We probably have to talk a little bit more about what typically we understand free will to mean, okay? Maybe we'll get to that when we get to some individual, we'll see. But, this capacity is in conflict with this picture. How do I square the circle? Now, there are ways we can square the circle, right? We could square the circle in this debate, for instance, by taking the compatibilist route. And this is, in fact, something that many people in the Nietzsche tradition, or who are working in the Nietzsche tradition, who Nietzsche scholars, try to do, right? So they notice that Nietzsche seems to talk positively about freedom, and seems to even talk about freedom as involved with processes of self-reflection, self-knowledge, and all that stuff. They are willing to acknowledge all that. But since they also acknowledge that Nietzsche has a moral psychology, apparently, that is deterministic in these ways, they say the solution is Nietzsche must have been a compatibilist about free will. Okay, that's the solution. So let's go compatibilist. Now notice, we're doing precisely what I said we're in danger of doing. We're bringing in a concern we have which is a debate about free will. I'm really interested in this debate. I want to know if I'm free, okay, or not. I want to know what the nature of reality is and whether this nature of reality includes beings that are free and therefore me as a being that is free. That's what I'm really concerned about, or something like that. And I want Nietzsche to answer, right? What does he believe, right, about this debate? I'm forcing Nietzsche to give me this answer, and I'm going to be disposed in certain directions if I'm disposed to acknowledge that Nietzsche speaks positively about freedom and that he also has a moral psychology that seems deterministic and all that stuff. So I'm going to be naturally gravitating towards saying Nietzsche must answer this way. He must be a compatibilist of some sort, of some variety, right? Even if I'm having, even if I'm trying to develop theories that are outside the traditional ways in which you think of compatibilism. So, for instance, some Nietzsche scholars try to develop the expressivist notion of Nietzsche's agency. So, agents express their being or something like that in their actions. But when you explore what this expressivist meaning of expressivist theory is saying exactly, well, it's a kind of variation of a compatibilist notion of things, right? You express things in a world that is deterministic and all that stuff, and so yeah, your expressions and the way you are in your actions is kind of dictated by forces that are deterministic forces that it's in many ways are outside of your control. That's it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we get this tendency, but is that the way Nietzsche talks about freedom? When he's positively talking about freedom? Have we asked that question? No, we haven't. We kind of like been blindly already predisposed to the answer Nietzsche must, when he talks in the genealogy about freedom, in the positive way he does, when he calls the sovereign individual a master of a free will, it must be free will in this compatibilist sense, because otherwise we have a contradiction, right? And Nietzsche contradicting himself? What? Okay, that no, we are after truth, right? Truth cannot be contradictory, first of all, right? We have a conception of what truth must be like. Truth is such that the collection of all true facts cannot contradict each other, okay? For instance, right? So we got to iron out these contradictions. We got to get rid of them, okay? But then go look at the genealogy. If you look at the genealogy carefully, I submit to you that the conception of freedom that Nietzsche is trafficking with in the genealogy is not a compatibilist conception of freedom. The things he speaks about in the genealogy are spontaneity in good and evil, okay? He speaks about, I could have done otherwise, right? Coming to realize that I could have done otherwise. These are the two basic conceptions of what it means to be free to the ordinary person, right? Mm-hmm. Ordinary people believe, ordinarily we believe, to be free means I am in charge of my behavior because I can spontaneously begin a causal series, right? I can spontaneously inject myself into the world and do either A or B. I can be spontaneous in good and in evil, as Nietzsche says when he says the Greeks, well, he doesn't say, I don't remember he says the Greeks, but he says, the philosophers invented the concept of free will in order to keep the gods interested in us, right? A wholly deterministic world would not have been an interesting world for the gods. So what is this concept of free will that they invented? Is the concept of spontaneity in good and evil, and the concept of basically that the humans could have done otherwise, right? They could have acted differently. That's the libertarian concept of free will. That's not the compatibilist notion. Notice the explicit language about not deterministic world, right? He kind of says that the deterministic world would have been a boring world, because then these creatures are just passive spectators of life. They're just muppets, right? Being manipulated by things beyond their control. That's not interesting to a god. What's interesting to a god is, in the Iliad, I want, Hector to win. Oh, but this Achilles does some things spontaneously that mess up all my plans. Okay, so it's like, because notice the idea, the interest in the gods. So this is not the invention. This is something that many I think scholars miss, right? They tend to think that Nietzsche thinks that the invention of libertarian free will is an invention of Christianity. No, the invention of libertarian free will it's a prehistoric invention of people who believed in many gods. I don't know if it's the Greeks, but it's anybody. In fact, I think it's anybody, because the genealogy is tracing the ways in which we became the animals that we are. And what are these animals? There are animals that are moral. And what is one of the most important moral categories we human animals use today? It's the category of free will. Compatibilist free will? No, compatibilist free will is a free will that only philosophers can come up with, okay? When they start to realize that there is incompatibility between being free in this spontaneous, I could have done otherwise way, and what my science is telling me my world is like, which is causally determined and all that stuff. So I must come up with a different definition of freedom, one that is going to make these things compatible, right? And they do a good job of telling us, look, freedom is about non-coercion. It's not about not being caused or causally determined to act in the ways that you are causally determined to act. But they do a terrible job of convincing us that what we mean by I could have done otherwise is it's just logically possible that if the universe had been different, my action would have been a different action, right? That's not what we ordinarily understand ourselves to be saying when we say, I could have done otherwise. When we say, I could have done otherwise, what we mean is, I was spontaneous in good and evil, and if I did the evil thing, guess what? I could have succeeded at doing the not evil thing, okay? And that's why I feel bad about myself, partly, right? Because I understand myself to be a morally responsible agent that has libertarian free will, if you wish to put it that way, right? The sort of free will that doesn't seem quite compatible. So, and that's the free will that the sovereign is a master over, I think. He's a master over, if you are careful in the analysis of the genealogy, you find out that the mastery the sovereign individual has over free will is over the libertarian free will, over the concept of free will that we humans have been bred to understand ourselves to have through these historical processes that Nietzsche is retracing. So let's go back to your problem, the squaring these things. How do we square them? Well, let me now pause and say, hold on a second. Remember, you're trying to foist this problem of squaring the circle here because for us, there is a contradiction that needs resolving in the free will debate. But is Nietzsche interested in the free will debate in this way? Maybe not. And so he's perfectly fine with contradicting himself, with maybe giving you a moral psychology that sounds very deterministic and, that ultimately reduces everything to drives. And then when he's interested in his ideals about how are we going to become flourishing animals and all that stuff, let's talk about free will and becoming a master of a free will, understood in a libertarian sense, not in a compatibilist sense, right? Understood as the master of a creature that has mastered the understanding he has of himself as a creature that is spontaneous in his actions and can initiate causal series spontaneously, and that knows himself to be able to do otherwise, so that he feels bad if he does something that then he regrets, right? Or he has remorse for, etc. I think that's maybe what we should do. Now, of course, this would mean, well, Nietzsche's contradicting himself. Why would he do that, right? I mean, shouldn't we be after truth? Shouldn't we be trying to figure out what the truth is? This gets us into a very complicated debate, because this has to do now with the debate about truth and falsehood, and whether Nietzsche, for instance, embraces a falsification theory about all of the, which is a metaphysical kind of claim, and also epistemological, but metaphysical claim about how we are condemned as the creatures that we are to misinterpret the world, right? And to foist onto the world categories and concepts that are errors, that are mistakes, that are falsehoods. And we can't help but do that because of the evolutionary process through which life was formed. Life, even the amoeba, right? The amoeba was formed through evolutionary process that incorporated errors into its formation. And then when you get to very complex beings like us, those errors have grown into other errors and have spurred other errors. And now we have errors everywhere. And we are a creature that has incorporated two errors, because this is the other side that people don't, and forgive me for going over a little bit in my answer, but this is the other side that people often don't emphasize in this debate. namely that Nietzsche calls the concept of cause into question, right? Even in the causa sui passage in Beyond Good and Evil, which is often used to say that Nietzsche rejects the libertarian notion of free will, right? Although, you know, a libertarian notion of free will is not necessarily the notion of a causa sui, right? The notion of being cause of yourself. I think that's a mischaracterization in some ways. You don't have to necessarily think that you have to be a cause of yourself in order to believe that you can be a spontaneous initiator of causal series, or that you have to, or that you could have done otherwise, right? And Nietzsche is in fact very clear that that's a superlative metaphysical notion, right? Perhaps the libertarian, more traditional libertarian notions are not superlative metaphysical, but only metaphysical, right? In a more humble way or whatever, right? So these are questions that are very complicated and that we need to go on. But just to get back to the point, in that passage, Nietzsche ends the passage by saying the problem of free will, and there he does seem to be referencing the traditional problem, the problem that we've been talking about, namely, how can I be free in a world that is wholly deterministic? He says, that's a problem that is profoundly personal, right? It's a problem that betrays the people who are involved in the debate. It betrays them in this way. The people who want to assert unfreedom of the will, psychological causal necessity, I think he even mentions in the passage, if I'm not misremembering, and all those things, they don't want to be responsible for anything. They are, in fact, they feel guilty. They are sick of themselves, right? They know themselves to be guilty of things that they're sick of. And they, with this inner contempt that they have for themselves, they long to shift the blame for themselves, for what they are, to somebody else. The other guys, the guys who have firm freedom in this libertarian sense, right? They don't want to renounce the responsibility. They want to believe in them. They believe in themselves so strongly that they want to preserve their personal right to be in control of their actions and to be the sole responsible causes of their behavior or something like that. And he even says vain races belong in this category or something like that. Now, I ask you, in this way of framing it, this personal way, which is the noble way of feeling, and which is the slavish way of feeling? Well, we know from the genealogy, and we know even from Beyond Good and Evil in other places, that the person who feels good about himself, who believes in himself, who has trust in himself, who does all those things, that's the noble. That would be on the free will side of the vain creatures who want to be responsible for everything, to assert libertarian free will. And who is the guy who doesn't want to be blamed for anything and wants to, renounce all responsibility and become just a causal arena for events and lay the blame of everything he does to his psychology or his society or his whatever, right? Necessary forces that are working in him. That's the slave. So one interesting thing about this is, even though Nietzsche is not taking a personal stand, and in fact he tries to give you a different category. He tries to say, no, we shouldn't talk about free will and unfree will and deterministic will. We should talk about strong will and weak will, right? That's what we should talk about, right? So he seems to be trying to go away from this debate by introducing different categories or something like that, But it's interesting that in the debate, and for the people who are interested in the debate, he's also telling you something very interesting. He's telling you the people who want to characterize the human being as without free will, without libertarian free will, or with a free will that is not really libertarian free will, but it's just a deterministic free will, which is, a free will where the agent is also not in control of his actions. Those people are slavish. They're under a slavish morality, and they betray a slavish morality. The other guys, at least they got this going for themselves, even if they are wrong too, okay? Even if they're trafficking with errors. Those guys are more noble. because they believe in themselves. They want to keep believing in themselves, and they are so proud and so vain in some ways that they want to not renounce their merit, right? See everything they do as their responsibility. It is also interesting that in this passage too, if I'm not misremembering, he says, all these concepts, freedom, causality, we have invented them. We humans. So this goes back to the issue I was telling you at the beginning. From a metaphysical point of view, it's hard to know what Nietzsche is saying, okay, first of all. What is the true metaphysics of the world, right? And I don't know if we can really reconstruct Nietzsche's metaphysics in a successful way, because I suspect, I haven't done it myself because I've been more interested in the ideals and all that stuff, as I've been saying. But I suspect if we try to reconstruct what Nietzsche's true metaphysics are, we're going to end up in a kind of very skeptical place, right? Where Nietzsche is going to say, look, I'm going to adopt the will to power hypothesis because scientific method demands it, right? And, and because we should talk about will, because we should postulate the will as being effective and efficient and all that stuff. And will can only move will. By the way, when he introduces that in Beyond Good and Evil, in that section in Beyond Good and Evil, that he introduces the will to power in this way as the hypothesis that we need to adopt, he's going to say, will can only move will. It cannot move muscles or matter or like other. That makes it sound like his metaphysics is a kind of panpsychist metaphysics, right? Going back to this mind-body problem that is it's a sub-problem of the free will debate, or is it related also to the free will debate? This problem, how do you get a mind out of matter, right? Out of material things going in the world, what physics tells us about. Okay, he seems to be postulating some kind of panpsychism or something, right? Will, after all, is a mental category. So he's saying will can only move will. So everything must be mental in some sense and be collections of wills, will to power or something. Very strange metaphysics. But he also is careful to say it's just a hypothesis, right? It's just I'm not actually necessarily saying this is exactly the way the world works. And here it is, the final metaphysics that's going to reveal to us what nature is nakedly, right? I found it. I am a physicist. I'm the best physicist ever existed. No, he's not interested in that, right? He's postulating it for the service of his philosophy, which is about culture and whatever else. So I suspect that when you try to interrogate Nietzsche metaphysically to the end, to the final consequence, what you bump into is a Nietzsche who is not fully convinced of whatever metaphysical claims he makes, and who believes that metaphysically speaking, the world is quite opaque to us, okay? Mm-hmm. And that ultimately we are going to bump into irresolvable unknowns. And because we are going to bound up against irresolvable unknowns, this percolates all the way back to the metaphysical debates you're having about free will and not free will. Because if you cannot resolve the ultimate issue of what nature really is like, then in some ways you can't really be sure that nature cannot contain a free will, right? Or that nature is purely deterministic, or that determinism is not really compatible with even a libertarian notion of free will. Because if there's a qualita occultas at the very end of everything, like the physicists in the modern era started to see, and even Schopenhauer repeats this too, right? Schopenhauer, who influenced Nietzsche when he was young, repeats this too, right? When we interrogate the metaphysics of the world from the physical point of view of the phenomenal realm, right? Schopenhauer says we always end up in this occult quality, right? That nobody can understand and nobody can really say anything about. Well, if we end in an occult quality in an opaque place where the light of reason cannot shine, how can we be sure that there can be no free will, for instance? Even if when we shine the light in the other parts that are not opaque, we see determinism going on. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see what I mean? Yeah. So this is part of the reason why I don't think Nietzsche, and we do a kind of disservice a little bit to Nietzsche when we try to get him to answer, right? You need to tell me, are you for libertarian free will to cord? And does that mean you reject all your moral psychology stuff about or not? Yeah. Now, this does make Nietzsche's philosophy contradictory. There are other contradictions. I mean, I just mentioned the will to power, to you, right? And where he says in that section in Beyond Good and Evil, I think Beyond Good and Evil, I'm very bad with dates too, but I think it was published in 86 or something like that, 1886. And there he's saying we must postulate the will to power as the principle that everything reduces to, okay? Or the thing that everything reduces to. And we must postulate it because by thinking that will is efficacious, and it can only be efficacious against other wills. 2 years later, 1888, in Twilight of the Idols, he's going to say, the will is an error, it means nothing, it moves nothing, it's not efficacious at all, it's just a word. It accompanies events, it could be absent. What? Outright contradiction, right? 2 years earlier, you were telling me will is efficacious. 2 years later, you're telling me the will is not efficacious. Which one is it? Are you changing your mind every 2 seconds or every 2 years? Right? What's going on? Okay. I think this is the wrong approach, because what we're missing is all my claims, they're in a particular context. When I make claims about the will not being efficacious, they're in a particular context, talking about certain things. And moreover, in a particular book with particular intentions. The book has a particular intention. Nietzsche is one of the most intentional writers that exist, okay? This is one of the things that is so attractive about Nietzsche, I think, and so seductive about Nietzsche. His supreme eloquence. He's a fantastic writer, okay? He writes so eloquently that it moves you almost in every page. But he's also super intentional. You get the impression that every word is there for a reason. Every comma, every, dash, everything has meaning, okay? It's not there superfluously. It's not just a decoration. It's not just a way of rhetoric flourish. No, it's intentional. When he says the sovereign individual is a master of a free will, there's a reason he said master, okay? Instead of saying, I don't know, anything else, the sovereign individual has the capacity for free will, or, uses his free will a lot, or, No, he said master. Why master? He's recalling the master from the first treatise, okay? This is another spontaneous. The master in the first treatise, by the way, he was described as being spontaneous. Spontaneous in his action, unconsciously spontaneous, because he's a beast of prey, he's an animal, okay? Now we have another master. Is this master an animal that acts spontaneously, unconsciously, and all that stuff? No. This is a master that it's at the end of a long process of actually breeding reflectivity and spirit into the human animal, okay? Making this animal be more reflective, be more rational, be more conscious of itself, okay? In all sorts of ways. So when you are recalling the master in the sovereign individual, you're trying to bring in the stuff in the first treatise and elevate it to a new position, right? Give me a different type of mastery, a different type of nobility now. That is the one that we should be aiming for, because it's the one that's promised in this huge labor of the morality of custom and all that stuff that has led to us, right? To us, the human beings of the present. Anyways, I think I overextended myself. I don't know. And I started to talk about other things that I know you want to talk about.
Yeah. I was going to say that we'll also get in a second into the ideal of sovereignty, because you've already got a little bit into it. But let me just ask you one more question about the ideal of becoming what one is. So what are then the mechanisms through which you suggest we can attain this ideal of becoming what one is?
Yeah, so again, the mechanism is self-reflection, self-consciousness, self-knowledge, okay? Self-understanding. But with the proviso, at least in the way in which Nietzsche tackles those issues in Ecce Homo, right? Which is a very problematic book, by the way. I should perhaps mention that a little bit, because Ecce Homo is an autobiography, but it's not a traditional autobiography. It's a kind of parody of an autobiography. Nietzsche is lying throughout Ecce Homo all the time, right? I mean, he's saying things that are outrageous, right? Like he never had any religious, he doesn't know anything about religious problems. When he was one of the most devout, adolescents in, he was thinking of being a pastor and whatever. He had no idea. He's never by experience had any notion of religious problems. It's a lie, right? He doesn't know anything about remorse. That's a lie, right? A person who's probably experienced remorse and guilt in his life. Moreover, he contradicts himself in the book, because he says, I will never forgive myself for not having an instinct for self-defense. Remember when I was talking about he was lacking that instinct of self-defense? He actually says, I will never forgive myself for not it's something that I will never forgive myself. Okay, so he has remorse. So he's lying all over the place. So it's a problematic book. That's maybe part of the reason why I've shied away a little bit from publishing this issue about becoming who you are. But in the book, if you explore it, he's saying, look, the mechanisms are mechanisms of self-reflection, self-understanding, self-knowledge, which you have to be careful how you use. Yes, of course. You have to sometimes not use them too quickly. You withdraw yourself, don't inject yourself into the causal stream, adopt a fatalistic attitude sometimes. That is good, right? Especially when you are sick, because you don't want to become a reactive agent. You want to preserve your freedom. Yeah, that's kind of the impetus behind it. So the mechanism is, I have to use my freedom understood as a freedom that I exercise through self-reflection and self-knowledge and self-understanding. But I have to do it in ways that sometimes actually misunderstands, right? Uses self-understanding to intentionally deceive myself about myself, okay? So that I can preserve myself, and so that other things that are working inside of me also have their say. So one thing that I want to be careful about is Nietzsche. I'm saying Nietzsche has a kind of libertarian notion of free will, where he's saying, you're in control of your action through reflection and all, but I'm not denying that he also says, I have instincts and I am a natural creature and I'm part of nature. I'm not transcendentally detached from these other aspects of myself, right? Of course, I am a natural creature with instincts that are working secretly inside of me, maybe in ways that I don't even know and I can't acknowledge. And all of that is important. I got to use that too, okay? My self-reflection has to let those instincts develop naturally, give them good soil, do those things, right? So that they don't make me sick, and that they can then accumulate all the forces that I'm going to need when I recollect myself in this moment of introspection and now understand myself properly. Yeah. And then become who I am. So the mechanism is a complicated mechanism in which you are using a freedom that Nietzsche seems to attribute to you, that works by way of self-reflection and self-understanding, and you need to do it in ways that also uses strategically that self-reflection and that self-understanding, so that you don't get in the way of yourself, right? And so that you can become truly who you are, instead of souring the fruit of who you are, right? Instead of spoiling it. It's a delicate process, right? That's kind of there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the ideal of sovereignty. You've already touched on it several times in our previous questions, and you talked also about what a morally responsible agent is. But let me ask you another kind of question about it. Many people characterize Nietzsche as a staunch opponent of the moral notion of guilt. But in your reading of him, or at least what I understood from your work, sovereignty entails embracing one's susceptibility to moral guilt. So could you explain that?
Yeah, because sovereignty, so again, this is going to take us a little bit into the genealogy, right, itself. So Nietzsche is doing a genealogy of morality, which is truly a history of how we became, it's really a history of humanity. That's why this tree that he's constructing is the tree of humanity, whose fruit is supposed to be, the fruit that is promised at the end of this tree is supposed to be the sovereign individual. Now, why do I say a tree of humanity? Because we are animals, but we are very different from the rest of nature, okay? We're very different animals. What is the thing that makes us different? Our spirit, our intellect, right? In German, Geist has this kind of like spirit, intellect, mind, our mind, yes? Our mind, our spirit, our souls are different here, right? From the souls of other creatures. How did we get this soul? This is what the genealogy is trying to retrace. So the genealogy is actually retracing the story of how we developed the sorts of deep spiritual capacities that set us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom, okay? Now, what are these capacities? Mainly moral capacities. What distinguishes us from other animals truly, in the end, is that we're the moral animals. We're the animals who can guide our behavior by moral norms. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So the story Nietzsche is telling us is the story of how we became the moral creatures we are, in some sense. It's also the story of how we've spoiled the thing that is promised at the end of this long history. The thing that is promised at the end of this long history is you're going to become the sovereign, you could become the sovereign individual, the master of a free will, okay? And all that stuff. He describes it, maybe I can read some parts of it, or we'll see. But, you know, there's a very eloquent language that he's using throughout that passage in the sovereign individual. It's that language that I, by the way, want to emphasize again, recalls the noble person of the first treatise in all sorts of ways, not just by mentioning mastery and lordship or being a lord, like 4 or 5 times, I forget, okay? He's a lord of every will, he's a lord of other creatures, he's a lord of, he's lord, he's lording everything, okay? So he's a master. But also by recalling things that he had said about the master at the end. He had said the master, you know, we live under a slave morality that has made us not fear masters anymore. We have no masters anymore. And there's nothing to fear in the human being anymore. But there's also nothing to reverence in the human being anymore. This is the big problem, right, for Nietzsche. Well, guess what? The sovereign individual, he arouses trust, fear, reverence, he tells us in that passage. Oh shit! So that's it. Sorry, pardon my French. Right? That's the noble creature, right? That he was talking about in the first treatise. He's recalled that language. Okay, so you know, very important. But this fruit is spoiled. The story in the genealogy is the story of how this fruit could be the promise, the completion of mankind after this long process, but it's also not the fruit we have because the ascetic ideal has spoiled the fruit. We have science today, which is not the opposite of the ascetic ideal, but it's its latest manifestation. Okay, now go back to the fruit for a second. What is this fruit? Well, again, it's to have a free will. But what is it to have a free will? To be, not just to have a free will, but to be a master of a free will. Okay, what is it to have free will? It's to think of yourself as spontaneous in good and evil, and to think of yourself as, I could have done otherwise, which also implies when I do the evil thing, I feel guilty. Okay, I don't like that things didn't come out very well. I feel polluted in my self-image. I feel like my actions have now betrayed my sovereignty, if you wish, right? Understood simply as free will, right? So the conception that we get at the end has to incorporate all these elements. I think this is something that the literature has missed. The literature tends to think that Nietzsche is contrary to guilt because he's against guilt is very bad. It makes you feel bad and it gives you self-contempt about what you've done and all those things. It's also associated, as I just mentioned, with a libertarian free will, which he is rejecting, right? He's supposed to be rejecting that. But as I've been trying to emphasize to you already several times, I don't think that's true. He's actually using this notion of free will positively in this passage, for instance, right? That's the free will that we have. So he's not against guilt. Now, of course, Nietzsche is supremely nuanced. It's going back to the issue of he's very intentional. The reason he's intentional is because he's very nuanced. The words he uses, especially adjectives or adverbs that he's going to use, they're intentional because they introduce a twist into what you have to be understanding, okay, him to be saying to you, right? And so the twist here is, look, guilt is dangerous, okay? Guilt, of course, it can be used against the human being in very pernicious ways, especially by the ascetic priest, who uses it to turn the human being into a sinful creature, for instance, right? In Christianity, or even in Buddhism, or even in, I think Nietzsche thinks all ascetic religions do this, right? In the end, they use the concept of guilt in order to make you into a sinner, which means you are inherently corrupt. And what is the thing that's corrupt in you? What is the corruption stemming from? Your free will. right? Precisely because you are spontaneous in good and evil, precisely because you could have done otherwise. That's the source of the problem, right? So you're using your guilt against you in a superlative way and in a kind of exaggerated way, and that leads to sin. Nietzsche is very much against that, for sure. But that doesn't mean that there are positive uses of guilt. Yes, of course, guilt is part of our moral psychology. It's part of who we are as human beings and what makes us special as human beings. What holds the promise of sovereignty for us, could hold the promise. If you only became a master over that free will and over that guilt that you have, and that you naturally have to experience because you are a creature that understands itself in those moral terms. If you became a master over it, now you would be sovereign, right? Now you would be sovereign. And the guilt would not consume you to the point of turning you into a sinner or to the point of making you renounce your sovereignty, which is ultimately the thing that the ascetic ideal wants, okay? I think, my interpretation. So that would be the way I would connect it. The problem is not moral guilt. The problem is not understanding yourself as a libertarian, free will endowed creature. None of those are the problems. The problem is whether you use all those categories that are now inherent to you, whether they're true or not, by the way. Again, going back to your question back then about like, isn't this contradictory? What is the picture of the world? Do we really have a libertarian free will or not? I don't know. I don't care. Nietzsche. Yeah, I don't care, right? I'm going to use the notion of free will masterfully, right? Nobly, to enhance myself and my fellow human beings as much as I can, which is the task. Okay, what matters is then, the noble uses I'm putting this concept to, not the fact that it could also be used slavishly, right? Wow, yeah, of course, it could also be used slavishly, and when it's done that way, guilt is very bad. It's terrible. Just like when free will is used slavishly, yeah, the libertarian free will, which the genealogy talks a lot about, how the slave and the priest use this concept to subjugate, to enslave, to belittle, to humiliate, to do all those things. Okay, yeah, when it's used that way, terrible. Okay, guilt, bad. But this is the nuance of Nietzsche. This is how he's beyond good and evil. One of the lessons of beyond good and evil is, look, the things we call good, they're also evil. The things we call evil, they're also good. Okay, they're like, there is no huge distinction here, right? In values. There's a nuance. It depends what forces are using these things and how they're using them. Tyranny is evil, but used in the right way, right? Which is, of course, I mean, this is a problematic claim, but anyways, right? Used in the right way, tyranny could be good, right? It could be good, yeah? Morality is a tyranny against the animal self that you are, for instance, yeah? But that's a great tyranny because it has bred in you the capacities to be in control of your desires and your passions, or to think of yourself as being in control of your desires and your passions, of your animal self. You're in control of your animal self. How did we manage that? We tyrannized against you with blood and suffering and cruelty and horrendous methods. That's part of the lesson of the genealogy. But that was great. I mean, it was horrible too. It also bred a mentally ill creature, yeah? A creature that now is in some tension with its animal self, right? Constantly. A tension that hasn't gone away because we are all constantly struggling with not becoming libertines, not becoming just vulgar pigs that just want to smoke a lot of drugs and go out and have sex with everything under the sun and waste my life doing pleasant things that are just the most vulgar things in the world. The struggle is constant, right? Not to revert back to that kind of animalistic predatory existence that we came out of, right? Nietzsche is very clear on that. So we gotta find a way in which we can use all these categories we are now endowed with that are part of our humanity in order to, here's what I would say, what is it to become a master of a free will? It's a little bit to overcome your humanity, right? To overcome the ways in which the human aspect, the human all to human aspects of you, your understanding of yourself as a free being, your propensity to guilt, your understanding of yourself as a being that can do otherwise, can be used against you, can be used against other people, right, etc. So I need to overcome that aspect of my humanity, learn to use guilt in a way that ennobles as opposed to diminishes or belittles the human being, humiliates the human being. Yeah.
Okay, so on the topic or the ideal of wholeness, then the most prevalent readings characterize this as an ideal of psychic unity aimed at restructuring the various parts of the agent's mind into a harmonious whole. What is your opinion on this thing?
Yeah, I disagree. Okay, so of course, remember that it's linked. This ideal of wholeness is very linked also with the ideal of becoming who you are. When you trace it, it tends to occur. They tend to occur close together a little bit in places. And so there's a tendency that maybe it's natural to think, oh, what Nietzsche's talking about, especially when we think, oh, moral psychology and all that stuff, that what Nietzsche's talking about is integrating your mental life, right? You have drives and desires and passions and ways of thinking and whatever, and you got to integrate all of this into some coherent whole, and then you become whole, right? That's what it means to become whole. Whereas if these parts of your psyche are all over the place, they're disintegrated, they're fragmented. Now, the reason I disagree with this picture is that when you go to the place where Nietzsche really talks about wholeness, because he talks about wholeness in these scattered places all over the place, throughout most of his books, later books in Beyond Good and Evil or in Twilight or whatever. But it's kind of, here and there, right, in some aphorisms. The place where he really talks about, hey, we have a longing to become whole. We should become whole. It's the untimely meditations. And when you go there, what you realize is that the talk of wholeness is embedded in a concern with what Nietzsche calls culture, which he actually defines by using the notion of unity. He says, a culture is the unity in the artistic, in every aspect of the people, which means they're forging into unity, content and form, right? Something like that. Paraphrasing very badly, but something like that. So it's really the concern with culture and the ways in which our modern culture in particular is a fragmented culture, is a culture that doesn't contribute to wholeness, but contributes to disorientation, fragmentation of the individuals that live in it. It's in the context of that Nietzsche says you should become who you are, namely whole, right? You should become whole. That's the task. Wholeness of the individual, and through the individual, wholeness of the culture as a whole. Okay, what does that mean then, right? What is it to become whole in this way? In my reading, and what Nietzsche tells us in this meditation is, well, you got to work at a goal, the goal of culture. Which is the goal of culture? The production of the genius in yourself and in all. This brings us back to this issue of uniqueness that we touched on a little bit way back, right? Everybody has a genius, right? Everybody has this thing that could raise itself from animality, okay? This is also a very eloquent theme, or a theme that is very audible in the meditations, this clash with animality, right? Constantly Nietzsche is trying to tell us the genius is the guy who's no longer animal, right? The guy who has raised himself from animality, who's trying to become truly human, a genuine human being, right? How do I become a genuine human? By overcoming my animality, by overcoming the things that are animality, right? That's how I become truly human. And what is that equivalent to? It's becoming free. It's becoming a free personality. My animality is keeping me from my free personality, right? Here I am. It has a kind of existentialist undercurrent, right, to the whole thing. Here I am, a being in this world. It was by chance. I'm a being in becoming. I'm an animal, right? Of course, I'm not denying that you're an animal, Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is not denying that you're an animal. Of course, we're all animals. But am I going to be just like the squirrel? Am I going to repeat squirrely behaviors? Am I going to change the world I've been foisted into? Am I going to legislate values to the world? Am I going to become my own person? Am I going to become free? And am I going to become a free personality that legislate values to itself and to the world, right? And what values should those be? That's the question. And the values they should be, I think, according to the early Nietzsche, is the values that allow genius to flourish. It's to say, that allow people to do precisely what I'm saying we should do, namely raise ourselves above animality, legislate values, change culture, change society. In the direction of what? In the direction of making us geniuses, right? Nietzsche is very universalist in the language he uses, even though he's also conscious of the fact that not everybody will be a genius. Not everybody will realize their productive uniqueness. Most of us will remain trapped in animality, but maybe we can remain trapped in an animality that is a little bit more ennobled and is not just debased and vulgar and libertine or whatever, if we all nonetheless are trying to struggle in pursuit of this cultural goal of genuine culture, which is the production of the genius, the production of the genius in myself and in everybody else. But if I fail to produce it in myself, there's still value, there's still a kind of dignity that I have, because I've worked for that. I tried, right? I was trying to contribute to that goal. So that's really what it is. Now notice, if you put it in those terms, that's how I become whole. I become whole because I became part of this project that is a collective project that is constantly being reinvented by all of us together, because it's the project of how do we bring about freedom and genius in the world? How do we bring about the elevation of the human being from its animality, right, into the world? What does it mean to become free in that sense? That's a project we're collectively constructing all the time, okay, together. And if we are into that project collectively as a culture as a whole, if our institutions are in the business of trying to produce geniuses, if our governments are trying to do that, if our economic system is trying to do that, if all society, everything in society is trying to do that, then we have a genuine culture, and our genuine culture will transcend itself. It will become eternal, right? It becomes a culture that we can all benefit from, even when the culture is dead, right? Like the Greeks, right? The Greeks are dead, the ancient Greeks, right, are dead, but we can benefit from tragedy. Here's my book, Birth of Tragedy, right? And I'm going to explain to you how we could recover some of the ways in which tragedy was doing precisely this to the Greeks of that time, namely putting them in the direction of pursuing the task of creating a genuine culture for themselves and for everybody else, right? That's what tragedy did for the Greeks in a nutshell, kind of. We could do the same. Maybe Wagnerian opera can do it, right? That's Nietzsche's story in Birth of Tragedy to some extent. So that's how we become whole, and that doesn't require psychic integration. I could be at this gentle, I mean, not too much, of course, right? We do need a little bit of mental integration. We can't be just a completely chaotic, bundle of drives and affects and passions and and thinkings and desires and wants. And if we are totally chaotic, then we cannot act. We cannot be free in the world, right? Of course, there has to be mental integration, a minimum of mental integration. But the task is not to integrate everything in my mental life in the pursuit of this goal. There might be things that are, I leave behind, or I still struggle with in the pursuit of this goal. My sensuality, for instance, if Nietzsche is right? I want to be a libertine, but I'm not going to be a libertine. I can't integrate libertinism into the goal of pursuing the genius. So you know what? I'm going to repress that side of me that wants to be a libertine or whatever, right? So I'm not mentally integrated after all, right? In that sense, I haven't integrated all my wants and all my desires and all my things into one coherent goal, because there are desires and things that I'm constantly keeping away from the coherent goal that I'm trying to pursue, which is the genius in myself and in everybody else. You see? So now, of course, I want to be careful. I'm not denying that maybe if it's typical of people who do pursue the genius, that they manage to integrate every aspect of their mental lives into a coherent whole. Maybe that's a natural result of actually pursuing the genius, but it's not a necessary feature of pursuing a genius, and it's not what pursuing the genius means. What pursuing the genius means, I'm working for the genius out there and in me. But what is that working about? It's about becoming free, becoming the unique individual that can make its own laws and standards and contribute to society by making his own laws and standards, which laws and standards are governed by the duty or the idea that I have a duty to produce genius in myself and in everybody else. So there's a there's an organizing idea that is external, that is kind of political almost, right? It's an idea about I need to help organize my society so that it contributes to my own genius and the genius of others, right? And the realization of the genius of others, so that and in doing that, I become whole, right? I become a whole human being, a complete human being. Yeah. There, because maybe I said too much.
Okay, so let me ask you now, I guess that following up on this bit about wholeness, what is the pathos of distance in Nietzsche, and does it involve contempt toward the common man?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a short essay on this where I'm actually arguing a little bit against Alfano's position and description of the pathos of distance as a pathos that involves a virtue of essentializing contempt against the lower man, right, on the part of the noble person. So now, so. One thing to say is there's not a lot of passages that discuss the pathos of distance in Nietzsche's published work, right? There's like 5 or something like that. One in Antichrist, but the important ones, I guess, or more important ones, are the ones that happen in Genealogy and in Beyond Good and Evil. And what he says in Beyond Good and Evil, in particular, is that the pathos of distance is socio-political pathos that exists in aristocratic societies. In healthy aristocratic societies, when this pathos exists, Nietzsche also says it generates or it contributes to the formation of another pathos, which is the internal pathos. Right? The pathos of inner distance, he calls it, which he also says is the pathos of self-overcoming. So the individual starts to look for, in the way he describes it, I'm trying to remember from memory, but he's saying something like finding distance within the soul, finding spiritual states that are rare, that are high, that are, unique, right? And all that stuff, right? Ennobling yourself. Enhancing your spiritual states. Now, there's some relation then between having a pathos of distance between classes. The noble class portrays this pathos towards the lower class. And, it's interesting that it's a pathos because, pathos is like, this is a term used in theater context in particular, right? When the actor kind of takes on a pathos that then is meant to evoke or elicit in the audience feelings of pity and compassion, typically, right? Nietzsche is of course twisting it, saying the noble adopts this pathos that then presumably elicits in the common man the feelings of distance, right? There is a distance between me and this noble, right? The noble is situated in a different place from me, from the rest of us. Right? That seems to be. And then the issue is, okay, how is it that this pathos generates this other pathos, the internal pathos of distance, right? Nietzsche says this other pathos of distance, this trying to ennoble yourself, is a pathos that gets generated only with the help of aristocratic societies. That's the way it has always been and will always be. So it's very linked in Nietzsche's own estimation with aristocratic forms of government, okay? Because in aristocratic forms of government, the socio-political pathos is the one that eventually provokes in the population. By the way, the population, not just, I take it means the slaves and the nobles, right? Or the plebeians and the nobles. In both of them, it provokes this inner pathos of distance, right? And so one question is, well, how is it that this is working? Why is it that noble societies or aristocratic societies, as Nietzsche conceives them, would generate this internal pathos of distance in the individuals living in this society? And my answer to that question is to say that the distance is not just a matter of superiority or power relations, right? That the noble is situated over here and he commands and he tells the plebeian what to do and everybody else what to do, and that he keeps them away and he, you know, keeps them enslaved and as tools for his plans and all that stuff. It's not just about that. It includes that, but it's not just about that. It's about the significance that the figure of the noble has in the eyes of himself and society and even the plebeian person. The significance is that the noble represents the highest power and splendor possible for the human type. Okay, he represents true nobility. Okay, obviously, he's supposed to represent true nobility. In healthy aristocracies, because Nietzsche is also very careful, right? I mean, in Beyond Good and Evil, he ends Beyond Good and Evil by telling you what is noble, right? It's a section that says, what is noble? And it turns out when you read that section that what is noble is, it's something very difficult to achieve, okay? Nobility is very rare in some sense. So even when you have aristocratic societies, I imagine Nietzsche would say most aristocratic societies are corrupt aristocratic societies. They're not true aristocratic societies. They're not healthy aristocratic societies. They are societies like the French, prior to the French Revolution societies, where they were just libertines. To be a libertine is not to be noble to Nietzsche. Again, you got to fight that animal urges of just giving into pleasure and excess and like living a life that is just relaxed and exploiting others for the sake of exploiting them and all that stuff. That's not nobility for Nietzsche, okay? So, of course, maybe he over-romanticizes aristocratic governments, right? But we got to work with what he's giving us. So the idea is, in a healthy, in a genuine aristocracy, the aristocrat actually represents a person who's spiritually deep, who's spiritually genius, who's spiritually, you know, giving us laws that contribute to the genius in us and in everybody else, presumably, okay? Mm-hmm. In that society, the distance that is generated is a distance in which the noble stands out as meaning-giving. It justifies everything else that's happening in the society, the oppressive structures that are happening, the way the noble oppresses the other people or whatever. All of that is justified because it produces this kind of human being that, as Nietzsche eloquently puts it, restores our trust in the future, in ourselves, in humanity, right? I mean, he uses this kind of language, right? So, okay, so you're producing beings that restore our trust in humanity and in ourselves and in everything. No wonder that this kind of arrangement starts to reflect back in me, into my psyche, by way of demanding that I try to do the same, that I try to become a genius, right? I should become a noble aristocrat too. I should try to ennoble my inner states as much as I can, okay? I should seek within myself the deepening of my soul, the deepening of my spirit, of my intellect in the right way, right? I should fight against my animality and for the late Nietzsche and certainly for the Nietzsche of Beyond Good and Evil, against my humanity. That's why I have to be beyond good and evil. I have to be beyond morality a little bit, which is the thing that makes me human, right? Because part of what happened to Nietzsche was he realized that the ideal of the genius is easily corrupted, easily corruptible by my humanity, by the aspects of my morality, by the aspects of my humanity that could stand in the way of the completion of my humanity, the realization of my humanity in the form of sovereignty, for instance, right? This is one of the things he realizes early on in his, and this is part of what, this is why his next book is Human All Too Human, right? He's trying to figure out what are these human all too human parts of my humanity that are keeping me, that are standing in the way and that keep pining me down to my animality, even to make me revert back into the animal, belittle myself, humiliate my humanity to the point of destroying it and all that stuff. What are those parts? Oh, it's morality, right? It's Judeo-Christian morality in particular, right? Especially, it's the ascetic ideal, it's all those things. Those are the things that stand in the way. Okay, I gotta overcome my humanity now, overcome those aspects. And hence, the superhuman becomes the ideal, right? Let's overcome humanity. Let's be superhuman now. So and that's what Zarathustra in some ways is doing, right? So I think we need to overcome our animality and our humanity, and this is to ennoble ourselves. And Nietzsche thinks this is done in a healthy aristocratic society because it has the pathos of distance, okay? And it's going to inject in us the pathos of distance in some sense, in our souls. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have just one last question then. Is this pathos of distance, since you say it would occur in an aristocratic society, is it in any way compatible with democracy? And what were Nietzsche's more general ideas about democracy?
Yeah, I haven't done a lot of work. There are good people doing work on Nietzsche's politics that you should speak to for this question in particular. But I haven't done a lot of work on Nietzsche's political views really, other than this pathos of distance paper. But I mean, there are some things to say. Obviously, Nietzsche had very precarious models of what democracy looks like, or what democracy is, right? He has the United States, the oldest modern democracy, but that's born in a contradiction even, right? I mean, it's born in white supremacy and like all sorts of things that contradict the very ideals that the democracy is supposedly founded on. So, like equality and freedom and all those things that typify democratic governments, right? A democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people, so that all the people can, increase their welfare, right? Their happiness, and their conceptions of the good can coexist with each other, can be, can be pursued without interfering with each other. That's basically an idealized version of what a democracy should be. But actual democracies are a mess, right? As we know, right? And they're under threat nowadays. So so it's a complicated thing. Nietzsche didn't really have even the modern democracies that we have now, where we could see that maybe there are ways of handling some of the issues that democracies present. So his model is very precarious. He is convinced, of course, he presents himself as a radical aristocrat, and as somebody who's pro-aristocracy, aristocratic forms of government. So he's very much against democracy. It's a question whether he would accept that you could produce the pathos of distance in a democracy or not, okay? Because he's not thinking in those categories. He's not even, contemplating the possibility, I don't think. So it's a question for us, right? The question is, could we take this element, if we think that it's a valuable element in Nietzsche's philosophy, and adopt it to our democracies, right? And make our democracies kind of organize our democracies in such a way that we could perhaps potentially provoke the pathos of distance, the enhancement of the human being in all our citizens, right? Or in our citizens, or in the majority of them, or whatever. Help our citizens to see themselves as somebody that is tasked with the issue of ennobling themselves, of trying to contribute to the ennoblement of the human being and whatever else. Mm-hmm. That's a question for us, and there I don't know how I feel about what answer to give, because I mean, to some extent I think yes, we can, right? I mean, it doesn't seem incompatible in any fundamental way with democracy, that we could in fact organize our societies such that we're not just interested in the welfare of the human being and in the conception of the good understood as very personalistic conceptions of the good as coexisting, which is human, but that we could even give them more ambitious goals, right? That the human beings should have the ambitious goal of contributing to the enhancement of the human being and the ennoblement of the human being, and the being that is constantly working on itself and trying to become not better, but nobler, right? Mm-hmm. Higher, finding rare states in himself, higher states in himself, all this description that he's giving you there. Okay, I don't think there's anything inherently that would stand in the way of that, especially because the pathos of distance, although it involves a kind of contempt towards the person who's lower, the person who's not ennobled, right? The person who's not noble, who's too vulgar, who's like trying to be a libertine or whatever, trying to give in to his animal side. it involves a contempt towards that from the point of view, from the vantage point of the person who is trying to ennoble himself. But it's not an essentializing contempt. It's not a contempt that says, "Oh, you are vulgar, and there's no redemption for you. You are going to be vulgar for the rest of your life. You are just vulgar. Period." Right? Some kind of essentialist, causally deterministic picture of like human beings. No, the pathos of distance incorporates, as you said, in the sovereign individual. Certainly, presumably, it incorporates this idea of you are free. We are free as noble, right? I can be a master of a free will. So I can change that. I can work on myself. I can try to become spiritually more elevated, okay? Anybody can. And maybe if these vulgar people are not doing it, it's because something in my society is not working right to make those people see that they could do that. Maybe I should change my institutions of higher learning so that, you know, people don't just think of their education as, oh, I need to go to school to get a diploma to get a job, okay? And that's what I'm doing here in this higher education place. No, maybe I should go to the school to improve myself, to like learn things about myself, to like transform my being, to learn for the sake of learning and not, you know, for the sake of getting a job or getting a title, or not this transactional way in which we've conceived of the higher educational system, right? This kind of capitalistic way of thinking about education. No, let's do the noble way of thinking about education. Maybe that can help. Now, again, this is something that we can do. I don't know if Nietzsche would be on board. Probably not. Okay, Nietzsche's dangerous. Because there are, of course, precisely because he's a critic of democracy, we have to recognize that there are, and because he talks about power, and because he's anti-egalitarian, and because we have to recognize that there are many elements in Nietzsche that are proto-fascistic, even if it would be a complete, I think, twisting of Nietzsche's philosophy to align him with fascistic ideology, okay? Because there are many things that he would be mortified about if he were aligned with that, right? Most fascists are just vulgar libertines, right? For him, that they're not noble, they don't represent nobility at all. So they are not really, it would be terrible. It was just power for the sake of power, and they are just, you know, in it for themselves and all that stuff. So horrible. No way Nietzsche would have been on board with fascistic policy. But Nietzsche is a guy who talks about power. Nietzsche is a guy who talks about inequalities and hierarchies. He's a guy who talks about, you know, misogyny a little bit, right? He seems to have a little hatred of women, or certainly he's not on board with the equality of women and stuff. He's not on board with universal education either, right? He's like, he wanted the institutions not to open up, to allow people from all socio-economic backgrounds to come to the university, right? He thought he was an elitist, right? And so, yeah, so it's very dangerous. He himself owned up to it, where he says, "I'm not a man, I'm dynamite." So, yeah, you got to handle him with a lot of care, right? Because there are elements in Nietzsche that can be exploited in the service of a very fascistic, anti-democratic form of government. But maybe there are elements that can be used within democracy and with democratic ways of thinking. And I think I don't see, of course, without having analyzed it deeply, right? I don't see any reason why democracies could not incorporate among the things that they do a way of trying to encourage people the citizens in their societies to adopt the pathos of distance, to try to ennoble themselves, to try to collaborate in a project of ennobling humanity as a whole, right? I think they could, right? So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Okay, great. So let's end on that note then, Dr. Zamosc-Regueros. If people are interested, where can they find your work on the internet?
You can find most of my work online. I'm not very good at online presence, keeping a steady online presence and stuff like that. I'm kind of old-fashioned a little bit in this way. But you can find in academia.edu, some of my work that you can download. You can find it in Phil Papers. I'm trying to also start to go to other of these kinds of websites, but again, it's very slow, and I haven't been very proactive at doing it in the right way. But you'll find, if you Google my name, you'll probably find my work and can download it for the most part for reading.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Ricardo. It was very enjoyable. Thank you again for inviting me. It's a great honor.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.